Hello, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is David Duncan. I'm a consultant with IBIS. Today we're going to go through and take a look at a feature dynamic GP known as SafePay. This should be a relatively easy to understand tool, but I think it will be a very valuable tool that you can use to help your business prevent the negative effects of payment fraud. As you'll see as we go through today's session, you'll see that this is a very easy tool to set up, and hopefully today we'll give you some ideas on how you can prevent payment fraud with your own organization. Payment fraud is something that can have quite a disastrous effect on your organization. There is a recent survey done in 2011 known as the Payment Fraud and Control Survey. This was done by the Association of Financial Professionals, and it's a very good survey for detailing some of the negative effects of payment fraud, and you can find the source down there at the bottom there, the aftonline.org/payment fraud. I would encourage you to take a look at this report after today's session. This report identifies some of the areas of payment fraud that are experienced by other organizations. It says in this report that 71% of all organizations in the year 2010 experienced some sort of payment fraud, whether that was payment fraud associated with checks, manual checks that were cut to vendors, whether that had to do with ACH, wire transfers, or even the use of a credit card or some kind of debit card. But that's a pretty high number when you think about it, and that number actually, that 71%, has been relatively consistent over the last 5 or 6 years. So there's been a very high rate of payment fraud in the last couple of years. So it's definitely a problem that does not seem to be going away. Of those organizations, that 71% that are experiencing payment fraud, about 93% of those organizations reported that the primary point of payment fraud for them had to do with the manual checks that they create and send to their vendors. So if you are an organization that utilizes the select checks, check run process, and dynamic GP, you are definitely one of those organizations that may be at risk for attacks against using your payment. So this is something that we will be able to discuss using SafePay as a feature that can reduce your risk of payment fraud. That survey continues on to say that of those organizations that actually suffered some sort of financial loss due to payment fraud, the typical value of that loss was around $18,400. That is not that is an amount that is not probably does not consider in the extra time and energy that must be devoted to stopping and preventing payment fraud in the first place. The good news about SafePay is it is something that may require a little bit of time to set up and a little bit of time to maintain going forward, but it is a very minimum overhead when it comes to taking the time to do this, and in the end can possibly prevent you from experiencing the kind of loss that organizations in that report have experienced. The ways in which check fraud can occur, there's a couple of them, and just about all of them identified by the report can be minimized or negated through the use of SafePay. For example, one of the areas of check fraud involves creating counterfeit checks by using NICR line data. Other more common methods include the alteration of payee names or the dollar amount on issued checks. So someone getting a hold of a check that you've issued out of GP and making modifications to either the person on the payee or memo line, or making a modification to the dollar amount itself. For your organization to monitor this can be a bit time-consuming, but time can be minimized by using SafePay to provide protection for you in the case of payment fraud. So how does SafePay actually work? SafePay is the dynamic GP term for something that most banks will probably refer to as positive pay. So when you contact your bank about this, you may ask them, they may be unaware of what the terminology SafePay represents, but they may be more familiar with the term positive pay. SafePay ensures that only authentic checks will be paid by the bank on your behalf. And the way that the banks can ensure this is by having you utilize the dynamic GP SafePay module and to upload after each check run or after a series of check runs, submitting a positive pay file to your bank that contains details of that check run. The details in the check run will include things like the check numbers, the payee or the person or thing on the memo line. It can also include things like the dollar amount, the check date, and so on. This is very similar if you're someone who uses electronic banking already and you're familiar with setting up EFT file formats. This is something that you would be familiar with. Prior to actually paying a check on your behalf, the bank is going to actually compare the check details, the check that's been presented to them, and they're going to compare that to the file that you've uploaded to ensure that a match exists. If there's any discrepancies, whether it is in the check numbers, the payee, the dollar amount, the check date, anything of that sort, the bank will contact you to determine, to let you know that there is a potential source of check fraud. So again, this is something that really can reduce the ability of someone to get a hold of one of the checks that you cut out of GP and to make modifications to it and then present that as a valid check to the bank. The bank now has an awareness of what checks are considered to be valid by your organization. Installing SafePay. SafePay used to be part of electronic banking. It still is associated with the electronic banking module, but now with GP 2010, SafePay can be installed using the select features function when you're going in and doing the install in the first place. You can see right up there on the screen that you can select SafePay as one of the features you would like to install. If you have already installed GP 2010 and you have not installed SafePay, that is something where you can go into the add and remove program to change the dynamic GP install, the client, and add SafePay as an additional component to your current GP install. It should be noted that in cases where you have multiple client computers, you should install SafePay on each computer in which checks and voids will be generated. Otherwise, if you don't do that, anytime someone runs a check run or voids a check from that particular computer, it will not generate, it will not provide you the details necessary to generate the output file format. The process to configuring SafePay, as I've alluded to earlier, can be, it can take a little bit of time to get it set up. But hopefully you're starting to sense the value that lies beyond the initial setup. Once you've got the setup done, the process is relatively straightforward and takes very little of your time. So this is definitely one of those areas where spending a little more time in setup will greatly reduce your need to make any changes or modifications or have to deal with any cases of payment fraud down the road. First step to configuring SafePay is linking the checkbook ID to a bank ID. We can see this in GP. This is something that you may have already gone through, but in GP we can notice under Tools, Setup, Company, we have what's called a bank setup. And here we can actually set up a bank ID to represent each of the different banks that we may do business with. Once we've set up our bank ID, our next step is to link that bank ID to a checkbook. We can get to our checkbook under Card Financing Checkbooks. And when I click on that, I can click on the first bank here, and I can see that my first bank checkbook, which happens to be one of my operating accounts, is assigned to that bank ID that I just showed you, that first bank ID. So once I've created this combination, I need to have a valid bank/checkbook ID combination to be able to assign a file format to that combination, as we'll see in just a bit. Once we've gone through the process of linking the checkbook ID to the bank ID, our next step, or this can be done even prior to that checkbook bank ID step, is to obtain a positive pay file format from your bank. This is something that you will want to do ahead of time. If you are undergoing a GP implementation, you'll want to make sure that you check with the bank as early as possible to secure the instructions for creating the positive pay format to the bank specifications. This is kind of a similar process to setting up your EFT file formats for each different bank. you can probably do this at the same time that you're procuring the EFT file format from the bank. The bank will essentially provide you a file that shows you what the layout of the output file needs to look like, what fields does it need to contain, and how many characters should be in each field, and how many lines should be in the output file format, that sort of thing. Again, this is something that can take some time, so it's recommended to start this as early as possible, giving you the time to create the file format and test it to ensure that it meets the bank specifications. There is no one-size-fits-all format. All banks will have, most likely, will have a different file format for their positive pay program, so you will need to work with all of your different banks. If you have multiple banks that you work with, you will need to check with all of them to make sure that you get the appropriate file format for each different bank. Once you have your file format from the bank, the next step is to go into GP and to use what's known as the SafePay configurator to create the actual file format to the specifications of the bank. The SafePay configurator is located, as we saw back on that earlier screen, it's located under the routine, your financials, under SafePay. It's one of those tasks that's buried quite far down in the navigation path. So just remember that it's located under the financial routine. Under there, you see what's known as the SafePay configurator. When I click on the SafePay configurator, this opens up the window where I have a couple of steps in defining a format for the bank. Now, I've gone ahead and defined one particular format, so we'll go ahead and take a look at that. You need to give your format an ID, and in this case, I've given it the ID of sample. And you also need to give it a description, and although I've called this the sample file, you may prefer to give this a name representing the bank that this file is for. Once you've identified the format name, the next step is creating the output record lines. You'll notice that there's quite a few different output record lines in your file from the bank. You can have up to two kinds of headers. One is known as a transmission header, and the other is known as a as you see under the record type field here, we see that we have a transmission header, we have an account header, we have a detail account, and we have an account footer and a transmission footer. Depending on the bank that you're working with, they may or may not have requirements for one or all of these lines. Every bank will require that you at least have a detail account line set up. But for many banks, you will find that the header, the transmission headers, account footer, and a transmission footer are simply optional. So if they're optional, they're not required for you to set up at that time. So again, this makes SafePay just a bit easy to set up, and that most banks will only require that you set up a detail account. So what you'll need to do is you'll set up under the output type 6 fields, and we'll set up an account detail line. Each one of these record types represents a different line in your file format. You might give it a name. You may follow the bank's format to give it a name for that line. And then you'll designate the number of fields that need to be on that line. Number of fields represent different columns, things like the check number, the payee name, the check date. All of those would be considered different fields. And you'll be able to identify those fields fairly easily from the bank's file format. They will probably provide you a table where each row on that table will represent a different field that needs to be set up within the file format. The last step that you'll need to do is identify the number of characters for that line, and what you may want to do in the table that they provide you is to take a look at the last field in that record type in that line and see the last digit that is used on that line. And in this case, we'll say that there's 150 characters for that entire line. Once you set that up, you can click the Add button, and you'll notice that it has now created an output record line up in my window here. When I click on this line, I notice on the right-hand side that I have individual record fields that I can pull up and refer to. Because I identified there were 10 fields on the file format, there are 10 fields listed over on the right-hand side of my screen. One thing to keep in mind about the record types, the banks will, depending on what bank you're working with, may have different terminology than what is present in the GP windows. Instead of calling it the account header, they may call it the file header. It will be difficult at times to tell how to align those files up exactly with what the bank specifications are. I will encourage you to take a look at the help files for this window. They provide information under the record type code telling you what each record type code represents. You can use that and compare that to the description provided by the bank to get a better understanding of what kind of record type you need to set up. Once you've chosen all the record types you need, you can add multiple record types in here. So if I need to add a header account field as well, I can also choose a header account, and I can call this the file header. And it just has one field of 10 characters, and I can add it. And when I add it, you'll notice that it added those in the order in which they appeared. In this case, our check detail appears ahead of the file header. Now, I'm not sure there's any bank out there that will want you to put the header information behind the detail. So in this case, we can click the up button to switch the order of the record lines in this window. Once we've gone through and added all of our record types, I recommend setting up all of the record types before you actually begin editing the individual fields within each record type. To edit an individual field, you can click over on the right-hand side and click on the field name icon at the top of the window. This will open the output field window for you, and you can start to identify and specify what each field represents. In this case, we may want to identify the very first value, the very first field, may be the transaction type. And in this case, we'll key in the transaction type, and that's the name of the field. The bank will provide you the name of the field, and you can just use whatever the bank has given you. The name of the field will not actually appear in the output file, but it helps you identify what that field represents. So I would go ahead and recommend using whatever the bank is giving you. The next step is identifying any one of the different standard fields that you want to use. In this case, we want this to be the transaction type. We want it to tell us, we want the first field on the detail line to tell us whether or not the detail record is for a check, is for an EFT transaction, or is for a void transaction. That's what the transaction type field will tell us. The next step that we want is to select text, and we'll say that the number of characters equals 1. I'll show you in just a bit how you can define what transaction types are. The next step that we want to have is we want to put in the filler information. The filler information is not really necessary for this particular field, but let's say the bank had told us that the first field must be 5 digits long. So we can come in here and put 5 characters, and we see the example down at the bottom is showing us 5 different characters. And we say that our filler type is 0, and we select the justification of the right. By selecting right justification, it means that the value, the transaction type in this case, will appear at the far right-hand edge of the field, and the filler, in this case the zeros, will extend all the way to the left of the value itself. If we left justify this, that means the very first digit of this field, and therefore the very first digit of this detail line, will be the transaction type, and the extra zeros will fill out to the right of that transaction type. So in this case, if the transaction type only takes up 1 character, we know that there will be 4 additional characters that extend out to the right of this particular file. So once we've got this set up like we want it, we can hit the save icon, and we'll notice back on the main window that our field type has changed from field 1 to field 2. Now let's take a look at the sample file format that I've already set up so that you can see an example of some of the different field names. In this case, this is a constant value. In field 1, we set up a constant value for a D. We can cycle through to the next field, and we see that the next field is the branch number. We see that we have the bank account number. We can use the standard field to select the account number, and that will grab the account number from the bank from the check. The bank ID that is assigned to the file format, as we'll see in just a bit. Next, we can choose, for example, the check number, and again, we can click on the standard fields to select the check number. This is not something that we would want to hard code in our file format. We would want the output file to change based on the actual check numbers that are included in the file that we've set up. I can continue on to the right. I may want to include the check amount, and the check amount, depending on the bank specifications, may or may not need to have a dollar sign or a decimal. So we can choose, depending on what the bank says, whether or not we should include a dollar sign or a decimal, or if we should not include a dollar sign at all. Continuing on to the right, we have several formats for dates. If we need to include the check date in our detailed file, we can, depending on the bank specifications, we can include the slashes to separate the months from the days and the years, or we can provide the format in the file such as YYMMDB without the slashes. Continuing on through, we have a transaction type. We've already seen this example. And I can continue on a little farther and see that the field name here is the payee, so we want to be able to provide information about the data that appears on the payee or the memo line with the check. And then the last page, and this may be common depending on the bank you're working with, they may prefer to have you populate or pad the output file with zeros. All of this is fairly straightforward, really relies on following the formats the bank is giving you and experimenting with some of the different formats, different ways that the record fields can be edited. A couple of things that we need to do before we consider this a wrap. The last thing that we will want to take a look at, and actually let's jump back over to the PowerPoint presentation here. This table right here identifies, I showed you when you were editing a record field, I showed you that there was a drop-down box for the standard field type. Standard field type is the best, is something that you will want to populate for every field, and you will populate it depending on what kind of data you want returned in that particular field. The options that we have under the standard field type, and this is pulled directly from the help documentation, so this is something that you can refer to as you're setting up your own file format. Standard field types that are available to us include the account number. This pulls the bank account number directly out of GP. You can also get the bank name. So the bank may have a name that they want you to include in the file. If they want you to pull the name from the description, you could do that. Or if you are concerned that somebody might be editing or modifying the bank name in GP, you can also possibly create this field as a constant value and hard code the bank name into this file format, so that nobody is less likely that someone will go into the file format and change the bank name than it is that they will go into GP and change the bank name in GP. We also have the check amount. This is going to be a very common field to use on your detail file. You can use the check date, check issue date, and the check number. All of these will be pulled directly from the actual checks that are included in the transaction file for upload. We also have what's called the constant field, so the bank may say, we want you to include the constant value ABC in this field. That's a designator that we will use and we will understand what that means, but we do want you to use this constant. That would allow you, by selecting that, the next field would open up and you could key in whatever the constant value is. They may also ask you to use filler space. They may say, we want you to pad the end of the line with 10 zeros. So you could use the filler standard field type to pad the rest of that last field with 10 zeros. We also have things like the payee that tells us, again, comes from the check. Today's date, they may ask you to create, to put in the file format the date that the file was actually created. They may also ask you to include the transaction type, identifying whether or not the transaction is a check or a void. And then last, the option we have for standard fields is the company name. You'll see in the description here the company name. Banks may often have a fixed field size for their company name and have specific abbreviations they want to appear in their files. So instead of using the company name standard field, you may be better off selecting a constant standard field type and entering the required abbreviation there instead. This is similar to what I discussed above with the bank name. Someone could easily modify the company name from GP, and that would fall outside the guidelines and specifications provided by the bank. Our next step with configuring SafePay involved creating the transaction codes that identify checks and void transaction types. We also need to link the output file to the bank and checkbook ID that we've set up in GP. And how do we do that? We go back into GP, and we will notice At the top of the SafePay configurator window, we have a button here that says Code Entry. We can check on the Transaction Codes button, and this allows us to pick up a transaction type. And in this case, the bank will also identify in the file format. This may come in a note section at the end of the file format. They may say, we want you to designate check detail lines with a C, and in this case, I put a C there for the check. They may want to have voids represented by a V, and they may want to have the EFT files represented by the letter E. Now, what they can also do is you can also do something like this. Under the check, you can select omit checks with alphas. That will mean that checks that have alpha characters, maybe you have REMIT as part of your check number, those will be excluded from the transaction upload if you need to, for example, exclude the EFT check from this upload file. Also, under the void transaction type, you'll notice that you have an option for voiding zero amounts. Your bank may ask that you only provide information that a check has been voided. They may not necessarily care what the amount of that check was that was voided. So you may be able to check this box so that your void record line does not include any data associated with the actual amount of the void. It's easy to overlook this window during setup, and something that I've done several times. And if you do fail to enter values here in this window, when you actually go to do the upload, you'll probably get an error message that says something to the effect of no check transaction type setup, upload aborted. What that means is you simply have not designated transaction types for the file format that you're using. So you'll need to come back into the configurator window and select the codes entry button at the top of the screen and designate a transaction code for each of the different transaction types. Once you've set up a file, the next step is to use the upload maintenance window to assign that file to your bank ID combination. And again, all of this is located under Financial Routine, so I'll click on the upload maintenance. And I'll pull up my bank ID. This is my bank upload ID that I created. The first step is to identify the ID. So in this case, I called it First to represent First Bank. The next step will be to select a bank ID, and then you will select your output format. Again, you'll remember I said before that it's very unlikely that you will ever have a file format that can be used across multiple banks. So in this case, I'm using the sample file format as the format for the first bank ID for First Bank. And you'll notice as well that I then need to go in and add checkbooks. This is why it's important that we link checkbooks to banks. If we have not assigned the bank to the checkbook ID, and we try to add the checkbook ID in this window, it will tell us that the checkbook ID and the bank ID are not linked together and therefore cannot be used. That's why it's important to go back and make sure that you've done that linking between the checkbook ID and the bank ID. Once you've assigned, if you have a bank that you have multiple accounts with, that bank may say that you can use the same file format for each of those different accounts. And in that case, you could actually add multiple checkbook IDs to this window so that you can generate a single file for all of your checkbooks at once. Down at the bottom of the screen, we have a upload file name and path. Every time we run the upload, it's going to generate a file at the designated location. If you are setting this up for multiple banks, you will want to be very careful to make sure that you select a different file name and path for each of the different banks, for each of the different upload IDs, to ensure that you do not overwrite files by accident. This process of uploading the files can actually be automated to the point that you create the file, and then you use a program, some kind of communication link, to automatically push those files out to the bank's online portal for the bank to download. This is not a requirement. You can actually just generate the text file and then manually upload the SafePay document yourself. The last option we have there is to include EFT transactions. If we are utilizing the EFT for payables management functionality, we can actually send payments from our EFT check runs to the bank as well. Once we've set all this up, we're ready to do our transactions, to upload our transactions. The way that will work is we actually will see this next window here that we will complete the check run in GP for a checkbook that's linked to a SafePay file format. So you'll want to do the setup first, and then when you actually go into GP and you use the select check process or any process associated with the checkbook that's assigned to a bank, that's assigned to a SafePay file format, once you've done that check run, you can then upload the file using the SafePay transaction upload window. That is also located under the Financial Routines window. So you'll go to Financial Routines, Safe Pay, and click on the Transactions Upload button. Here you will select a file format to use, and in this case we'll use the only one that's been created. And you'll have to key in a last upload date and an upload cutoff date. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to select April 12, 2017, and I'm going to say those are my dates that I want to look at. And then we'll hit the Load Reload Transactions. This shows me a list of all transactions that have been generated in my Payables Management module since the last upload date and since the upload cutoff date that have not already been loaded have not already been loaded using the SafePay file format. Once I've looked through this, I can see details of these transactions. I can see the checkbook, and I can see the type. So in this case, I see that I had a check that I had previously issued. I submitted it to SafePay, and I voided that check, and I'm going to reissue another check. Because I voided that check, it's now created a line here, a void line, that's going to submit that void line to the bank. So the bank, when they see that check presented, they will know that that check was voided, and they will be able to stop the payment on that check because they have received instruction from you that the file has been voided. We also see the more common file format types. We see that they are all checks. So I've had several checks that have been cut that need to be uploaded to SafePay. You can't be selective about this. This window is an all or nothing sort of deal. Once you've identified all the transactions, you can hit the upload button. It will ask if you want to proceed with the upload for selected transactions. And once you say proceed, it will create a file for you at the location that you've designated. So in this case, I have a file on called safepayupload.txt that's located on my desktop. You'll see another message that says, please proceed to upload the file to obtain the confirmation number. In this case, we will want to go through the process of finishing our upload. We want to go out to the bank's website, and we want to drop the file that we just created onto the bank's website and upload it. Once we've done that, we should expect to see a confirmation number that the bank gives us to let us know that the file has been uploaded successfully. For safekeeping and for confirmation purposes, we'll want to enter that confirmation number in the next window. So I can come in here and enter the confirmation number. Now in this case, I'm going to cancel this. If I say cancel, it's going to say upload was not successful, do not save results. This allows me to, if I realize, I forgot I wanted to include some different checks in that file before I submitted it, you can cancel it, and it will not, although it generated a text file, Dynamic GP does not register that you have had a successful upload of those checks to the SafePay portal for the bank. You can still, however, go out and take a look at the document that was created. So if I go out to my desktop, I see that I have safepayupload.txt. If I click on that, I see that it's generated a file for me. This file is using the specifications of the file format that I've set up, including my header line, and then it has one line for my detail for every single transaction that I had. So this very first line is my void transaction, and I can see that. It's a bit difficult to see here, but there's a V right there. That is the field that I used for my transaction type. And if you remember, I went to the transaction type entry window and said void transactions will be represented by a V. And then I had one standard field in my detail line that was called the transaction type, and it automatically looked up at the setup and saw that a transaction type for a void transaction should be represented by the letter V. So I see that first transaction is a V. And I see here that all the rest of them are checks. I see my payee information, I see the check date, I see my check number, and I see the actual amounts on the check. So you can see how your file format that you set up in the SafePay configurator window ends up looking in this by generating your SafePay upload text file. You can do this as a way to test and make sure that this works. The bank may ask you to submit some sample file formats just to make sure that you got the format right, and this is how you can do that. So that's really the process. Once you've done that, you can go back into GP and you can key in your confirmation number. Also, under the Routines window, under Financials Routines, you'll notice that there's two other windows that are not transaction windows. They're more of inquiry windows. I can click on the Summary History window, and I can click my Bank Upload ID. And it shows me a list of all of the bank uploads that I've done for that Bank Upload ID. This is a file upload that I did yesterday, and I can see that I entered a confirmation number, 1234 from the bank. And in this file, there was only one check, with an amount of $333.93. There were no void transactions. If you click on the Transactions button, this is the same thing if I were to go into Financial Routines and click on Transaction History. This actually shows us more detail about the actual contents of that upload file. In this case, you would come in here and you would check. Let me pull that window back up here. Under Transaction History, you'll pull up your bank upload ID. You'll see your bank upload ID, and then you can cycle through the various uploads, and you'll see the uploads are separated by the date and the time that the upload occurred. Once you cycle through your uploads, you can see details associated with that upload, including the confirmation number, the location that it was generated to, the upload date. You can also see things like the individual checks and individual voids that were included within that transaction. So this is a way to go back and take a look and see what was included as part of your upload. A couple of other comments to make as far as using SafePay. When you're setting up the file, you can test file output results by not using the communication link. Even if you do plan to have an automatic program that automatically uploads your files, you can uncheck that to generate the file to something like your desktop so that you can get more information, take a look at the file format, and see if it meets the specifications. The bank may also prefer to use, they may have a test portal that you can load this in, or they may have a location, they may prefer to email a sample file format to them so they can verify it on their own that it meets your requirements. Remember, I've said this before, each bank has a different positive pay file format, so no one size fits all. This is something to keep in mind. Do not try to reuse file formats, otherwise banks will likely reject those file formats. It's also important to notice that the details of a transaction can only be loaded one time. What that means is if a check is voided and you reissue a check with the same check number and the same transaction date, the same amount, the upload file is going to fail. The bank is going to reject that because the bank does not want to see the same detailed information come in. They don't want to see two files for the same check with the same amount for the same check date. So if you are going to void a transaction and reuse the check number, you must be certain that you select at least a different check date so that you can upload that file without causing any duplication errors. Another nice trick to know is you can actually use the import-export functionality in the configurator window to easily transfer output file formats from one company database to another. So keeping in mind that we can only have one file format per bank, you may have a test database and you may have a live database. You may set up your SafePay file format in the test database and then transfer it over to the live database. If you do that, you can actually use up at the top right-hand corner of your window, you can use the export button. You can export your file format out to your desktop, for example, and if I open this, I'll see that it's giving me some details. It's not something I can really read, the format that GP can read, though. So now if I come back into GP, to the SafePay configurator window, and I do an import, and I try to import that file that I just generated, it's going to ask me to enter a new bank ID for the import, and now I see that I now have a separate bank format that I can use. So if you've got a file format for one bank and you have another file format for another bank and there's only one or two changes between the two, it may be better off for you to use the export-import functionality to create a copy and use that and extend off of the imported version. One last thing that we can take notice of, in the transactions upload window, if you have a transaction, you have transactions in here, wrong window here, let me pull up the right window here. If you're in the transaction history window and you realize the bank calls you back and they say, you know, we gave you a confirmation number, but we do need you to re-upload the file. For whatever reason you need to re-upload, the transaction history button window allows you to upload the transactions that are listed. So if you, for whatever reason, need to re-upload a file, keep that in mind that you can use that window as a place to re-upload the file. that is pretty much concludes our session for the day. I wanted to provide you some additional SafePay resources in the event that you needed to refer to them. You'll notice in the electronic banking user guide for GP 2010, you can check out chapters 5 and 12. These chapters have to do with the setup of SafePay, as well as the use of SafePay. You can also refer to these knowledge-based articles, 850752. If you have a customer source login, you can use this to check this out. This provides you some pretty detailed steps, a bit more detailed than the user guide, I think, to setting up the SafePay configurator in GP. And then also 854519, how to re-upload a SafePay transactions upload file in a different format after it was processed in Microsoft Dynamics GP. This primarily deals with version GP10 and older, but it also provides some pretty good description of some of the tables, the SQL database tables that are involved in the SafePay upload process. So if you are someone, a DBA or someone who needs to access those files in the SQL tables, that knowledge-based article may be of help to you. As always with our webinars, if you have any questions, feel free to email them to info@ibis.com, and we will be able to get back to you and make sure that you can get your questions answered on a timely basis. Before we end our session for today, I do want to open the line for some calls, so I'm going to unmute this. If anyone does have any questions on the line, please feel free to ask those questions now. Otherwise, you can certainly utilize the email address at a later point in time when you're actually going through and setting up this functionality.
Quick question for you. We have wire transfers and check EFT today. Can we set up, did I understand correctly, we can set up two formats, one for wire transfers and one for the normal check EFT payment out of the same checkbook?
You can do it for EFT, you can do it for checks and voids that are cut out of payables management. So if you're doing something separate for wire transfers, you cannot do that.
You can or cannot?
You cannot. But if you're just using EFT and standard check process in GP, you can utilize SafePay for those kinds of transactions.
Okay.
Again, remember you can always email info@ibis.com with additional questions. If you have no other questions, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. Hopefully this session has been informative for you, and hopefully you'll join us back for another webinar session soon. Thank you.